In the heart of the warp storm, a golden figure descended, her armor gleaming like dawn breaking upon a world long since drowned in night. The tempest screamed around her, a maelstrom of impossible colors and shrieking unreality that had devoured entire fleets, entire civilizations, entire epochs of human memory. Yet she fell through it as a spear falls through water, untouched, unbroken, her very presence an affront to the hungry darkness that sought to unmake her. The warp recoiled. It twisted. It remembered when gods walked freely between worlds, when divinity was not chained to rotting thrones or shattered into screaming fragments across the Imperium. This was something old, something true, something the galaxy had forgotten how to be. Her descent carved a wound through the storm, a channel of impossible light that stretched from the bleeding edge of reality down to the scarred surface of a world whose name had been erased from imperial records 3,000 years prior. Where angels once wept, she strode now, bearing a blade forged in Olympus, sanctified anew by the Mechanicus in rituals that had driven 12 tech priests into cataleptic madness. The sword hummed with binary hymns and ancient Hellenic poetry encoded into its molecular lattice, a fusion of mythologies that should have been incompatible, but instead sang together in perfect, terrifying harmony. Each step she took upon the ash-choked earth sent ripples through the immaterium, like stones dropped into an ocean of souls. The banners of the Imperium trembled, sensing the arrival of something both divine and defiant. Tattered regimental standards planted by the Astra Militarum decades ago during failed reclamation campaigns suddenly snapped upright, their fabric catching winds that had not blown in years. Servitors frozen in their stations, since the last Vox transmission from Terra sparked back into sluggish life, their augmetic eyes turning skyward as if pulled by invisible strings. In bunkers buried beneath kilometers of rubble, dying soldiers felt something they had long since forgotten, not hope, for hope was a weakness in this galaxy, but purpose, sharp and clear as a freshly honed blade pressed against the throat of despair. Even the Astronomicon flickered, as if the Emperor himself took pause to watch. Across the galaxy, navigators screamed in their isolation chambers, clutching their third eyes as visions of golden lightning and ancient truth scorched through their minds. On Terra, in the deepest sanctums of the imperial palace, where only the high lords and the custodians dared tread, instruments that had measured the psychic emanations of the golden throne for 10 millennia suddenly spiked beyond all recorded parameters. Something had changed. Something had entered. The great game of gods and empires had gained a new player, one who played by rules written before the first human ever looked up at the stars and wondered if they were alone. She stood now upon a plateau of fused glass and shattered ceramic, the remnants of a battle fought so long ago that even the dead had forgotten why they died. Her armor caught the light of 3 dying suns, reflecting it back tenfold, a beacon that could be seen from orbit despite the perpetual storm clouds that shrouded this forsaken rock. The lasso of truth coiled at her hip, golden and impossibly bright, its strands woven from concepts rather than matter, honesty, justice, compassion, words that had become archaic curses in the Imperium's lexicon. Her shield bore no imperial aquila, not yet, but the dents and scorches upon its surface spoke of battles fought across centuries, across universes, against enemies that ranged from mortal tyrants to gods drunk on their own power. Diana of the Messira, no longer a daughter of paradise, no longer a champion of a world that had crumbled to dust in timelines that might never have existed, raised her eyes to the storm-torn sky. Behind her, the warp portal she had torn open with sheer force of will began to collapse, reality reasserting itself with the sound of breaking bone and screaming metal. Before her, stretching to every horizon, lay the 41st millennium, a galaxy burning, a species dying by degrees, an empire built on the corpse of its own dreams. She had walked into hell wearing hope like armor. She had stared into the face of absolute corruption and refused to blink. And now she had come here, to the cruelest darkness ever conceived, because she had heard something in the spaces between dimensions, a prayer, a scream, a desperate plea from billions of human souls crying out for salvation that would never come. The wind carried ash and the smell of ancient burning. Somewhere in the distance, a warning klaxon wailed its 2,000-year-old alert, automated system still trying to warn a garrison that had been dead since before old Earth unified under the Thunder Warriors. Diana's jaw set, her hand tightening on the hilt of her blade. She had faced Ares. She had stood against Darkseid. She had walked through the underworld and returned to tell the tale. But this was different. This was a war that had no end, no victory condition, no hope of peace. This was survival measured in centuries of agony, glory defined by how many seconds you could delay the inevitable. This was the Imperium of Man. And she had come to save it. The thought should have been laughable. One warrior, even one born of gods, against the endless night of the 42nd millennium, against chaos undivided, against the tyrannid swarms, against the cold certainty of entropy itself. Madness, hubris, the kind of foolish nobility that got entire sectors purged for ideological corruption. But Diana had never been one to calculate odds. She had been forged for a single purpose, to stand between the innocent and the darkness, no matter how deep that darkness ran, no matter how impossible the light seemed. If the Imperium was hell, then she would be its redeemer. If humanity had forgotten how to be human, she would remind them, one battle at a time, one soul at a time, until her body broke or the last star died. Thunder rolled across the plateau, though there were no clouds close enough to produce it. The storm above her began to spiral, a vast eye opening in the warp's flesh, and through it she could see Terra, impossibly distant yet somehow close enough to touch. The throne world, the heart of everything, the place where a god sat dying so that his children might live one more day in chains. Diana's eyes narrowed. She had met gods. She had killed gods. But she had never met one who loved his people enough to suffer eternally for their sake. That deserved respect. That deserved her sword. She took her first step forward, and the galaxy shuddered. Terra's spires split the heavens, Gothic monoliths wreathed in sacred flame. Their peaks vanishing into atmospheric layers choked with millennia of industrial exhaust and the perpetual smoke of burnt offerings. The throne world rose before Diana like a monument to obsession, every surface carved with prayers, every structure a cathedral, every breath of air thick with incense and the acrid tang of reactor coolant. This was not a world. This was a testament written in architecture and faith, a planet-sized declaration that humanity would endure no matter what sanity, beauty, or mercy it had to sacrifice. Billion-strong populations lived their entire lives in the shadow of statues they would never see completed, laboring on projects begun 10,000 years ago and still centuries from completion. The scale was crushing, designed to make every individual feel infinitesimally small before the majesty of the God Emperor's vision. Beneath the vaulted cathedrals, warriors knelt in prayer as the Amazon swore fealty to mankind's last god. They lined the processional, Astartes from a dozen chapters, their ceramite bearing the scars of campaigns Diana couldn't pronounce, their eyes hard as flint and twice as unforgiving. Guardsmen from 1,000 regiments stood at attention, lasguns held across their chests, uniforms pressed and perfect despite bodies ravaged by rejuvenate failure and augmetic necessity. The Sisters of Battle formed an honor corridor, their power armor gleaming obsidian and crimson, voices raised in hymns that made Diana's teeth ache with their psychic intensity. These were the faithful, the devoted, the ones who had given everything to a god they would never see, fighting wars they would never understand, for an imperium that would forget their names before their ashes cooled. Thunderhawks screamed through the crimson clouds above her, the choir of war reborn. The aircraft carved contrails through the smoke-thick sky, their engines singing in the resonant frequencies that Mechanicus doctrine held sacred. Each pass overhead was timed to the liturgical rhythm of the ceremony below, a synchronization of military might and religious fervor that would have seemed grotesque on any other world. But this was Terra. Here, War was worship. Violence was prayer. Every trigger pulled in the emperor's name was a sacrament. Every death a tithe paid to keep the golden throne burning one more day. The Thunderhawk's shadows swept across Diana like the wings of massive predatory birds, and she understood. She was being assessed, measured, judged by eyes that had seen heroes rise and fall like tides. And with a single vow, Diana became not myth, but weapon. The words left her lips in High Gothic, a language she had learned in the span between heartbeats through means that would have had her executed as a witch on any other day. But the custodian guard flanking the altar had permitted it, had recognized something in her that transcended mere sorcery. Her voice carried through the cathedral without amplification, each syllable striking the vaulted ceiling and returning transformed, layered with harmonics that suggested more than one throat spoke. By the stars that bore witness to my birth, by the blood that flows in defiance of death, I pledge myself to humanity's flame. Let me be your shield when darkness presses close. Let me be your sword when hope grows dim. I am Diana of the Masira, and I swear by every god that ever was, I will stand for humanity until the last light dies. The response was not applause. It was not cheers. It was the sound of 10,000 warriors striking their chests in perfect unison, a heartbeat of ceramite and faith that shook dust from thousand-year-old statues. The custodians, those golden demigods who had not knelt to any being save the emperor since the day they were wrought, inclined their heads a fraction of a degree. It was acknowledgement. It was acceptance. It was the closest thing to approval Diana would ever receive from beings who remembered when the Imperium was young, and the emperor still walked among men. One of them stepped forward, his armor inscribed with names in scripts that predated Imperial Gothic, carrying a box of black iron bound with wax seals bearing symbols Diana recognized from the deepest, most forbidden sections of the Mysiran lore. Inside the box lay a bolt pistol, its casing carved from a single piece of white marble threaded through with veins of gold, its mechanisms blessed in oils pressed from olives that grew in the emperor's personal arboretum, a grove that had not seen outside visitors in 7,000 years. The weapon was presented to her not as a tool, but as a relic, and Diana understood the weight of what she held. This was not merely firearm. This was trust, forged in a society that had learned through 10 millennia of betrayal to trust no one, to suspect everything, to see heresy in every shadow. By accepting this, she accepted chains. By swearing her oath, she had bound herself to a cause that would demand everything and offer nothing in return save the cold satisfaction of duty fulfilled. She holstered the weapon and met the custodian's eyes that had watched civilizations burn, that had seen the emperor's dream calcify into dogma, that carried the weight of failures Diana couldn't imagine. "I know what you've sacrificed," she said quietly, voice meant only for him. "I know what you've become, but I remember what you were meant to be. If there's any of that left, any spark of the dream that started this, help me find it. Help me fan it back to flame." The custodian said nothing. But his hand, for just a moment, rested on her shoulder with something that might have been gratitude or might have been warning. Then he stepped back, and the ceremony continued. Bells tolled across the palace, their sound carrying through hab-blocks where families would stop their meager meals to bow their heads, through manufactorums where workers would pause at their assembly lines to make the sign of the Aquila, through the depths where servitors with barely functional consciousness cores would cease their labors for exactly 12 seconds of silence. The entire world paused to mark this moment, though 99% of its population would never know why, would never hear Diana's name, would live and die in ignorance of the fact that something had changed today. But those who stood in the cathedral knew. The Astartes, whose superhuman senses could taste the change in the air. The sisters, whose faith burned bright enough to touch the warp. The guardsmen, who had learned to recognize the moment before everything goes to hell. Diana turned from the altar and walked down the processional, her new bolt pistol heavy at her side, her ancient blade singing softly against her back. The warriors parted before her like water, each one's eyes tracking her passage with the intensity of predators watching something they couldn't quite categorize. She was neither ally nor enemy, neither human nor alien, neither psyker nor null. She was other, and in the Imperium, other was the most dangerous category of all. But she had been blessed by the custodians. She had sworn before the throne, and so they would follow her, these broken angels, these faithful monsters, these last defenders of a species that had chosen damnation over extinction. Outside the cathedral, a delegation awaited, inquisitors in their shadowed robes, their rosettes gleaming like accusations, mechanicus magi with more metal than flesh, their optics whirring and clicking as they recorded every detail. And standing apart from all of them, taller than any human had right to be, clad in the blue and gold of Ultramar, Robot Guilliman, the avenging son, returned from death to find his father's dream twisted beyond recognition. His eyes met Diana's across the plaza, and she saw in them something she hadn't expected: relief. The relief of a man who had been fighting alone for so long he'd forgotten what an ally looked like. "So," Guilliman said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had commanded legions, "you are the weapon my father has seen fit to introduce to his Imperium. Tell me, Diana of the Messira, are you prepared for what that means? Are you ready to make choices that will damn millions to save billions? To become the monster so that others might remain human?" His tone was not cruel. It was the exhaustion of a being who had made those choices, who lived with the weight of them every day, who needed to know she understood what she had volunteered for. Diana met his gaze without flinching. "I've walked through the fires of apocalypse. I've stood against gods who fed on suffering. I've seen civilizations eat themselves from within. Your Imperium is dark, Lord Guilliman. It's brutal and it's cruel and it's everything I was taught to stand against. But it's also the last hope for trillions of souls who never asked to be born into this nightmare. So yes, I'm ready, not because I think I'll win, but because surrender is not in my nature, and as long as there's one innocent worth saving, I'll keep fighting. That's what I do. That's what I am." For a long moment the Primarch studied her. Then, impossibly, he smiled, a small, sad expression that transformed his face from a mask of duty into something almost human. "Then welcome to hell, Wonder Woman. Try not to lose yourself in it." He extended his hand, and she took it, the clasp of two warriors who knew the weight of oaths and the cost of keeping them. Above them, the Thunderhawks screamed past once more, and the red sky of Terra burned like prophecy. On Cadia's broken grave, her arrival was heralded by lightning that tore the warp asunder, great jagged scars of pure white splitting the purple-green sky, where reality and unreality had long since stopped bothering to pretend they were different things. The world had died. Everyone knew it. Cadia had broken before its guard did, the planet itself fragmenting under the weight of Abaddon's final assault, its pieces now drifting through a region of space where physics was more suggestion than law. Yet still they fought here, the survivors and the inheritors, the ones who refused to let Cadia die just because its corpse had stopped spinning. They held the fragments. They fortified the drifting continents. They built void shields between chunks of dead world and dared the despoiler to come finish what he'd started. Cadia had fallen, but it had not surrendered. Demons recoiled before her, the lasso of truth burning through their lies like holy plasma, unraveling the fundamental falsehoods that held their impossible forms together. A bloodletter charged, its blade forged from its own crystallized hatred, only to meet the golden cord mid-strike. The demon screamed, not in pain but in rage, as the lasso forced it to confront its own nature. The fact that it was nothing but emotion given teeth, hunger without purpose, violence that meant nothing beyond the moment of its expression. Truth was anathema to chaos. Reality was poison to creatures built from collective delusion. And Diana's lasso was both, concentrated into a weapon that stripped away every layer of self-deception until only the raw, pathetic core remained. The bloodletter simply ceased, not banished but unmade, its essence too disgusted with its own hollowness to maintain cohesion. Her shield clashed against the claws of Khorne's spawn, every strike a sermon of defiance written in the language of impact and force. They came in waves, bloodthirsters and flesh hounds, their brass collars inscribed with the names of the skulls they'd claimed, their roars shaking the ruins of Kasser Myrak's outer walls. Diana met them at the breach, her feet planted on ground soaked with the blood of 10,000 years of warfare, and she held. Each blow that struck her shield sent concentric ripples of golden light washing outward, and wherever that light touched, the warp's influence receded by inches. Guardsmen who had been fighting with eyes half lost to madness suddenly remembered their names. Commissars whose trigger fingers had twitched towards summary execution felt something they'd thought was purged from their emotional range: mercy. The demons felt it too, this creeping invasion of sanity into their perfect madness, and they redoubled their assault with the desperation of addicts watching their fix dissolve. Blood and faith mixed upon the soil, and the galaxy itself seemed to shudder. The defenders of Cadia's grave had long since stopped expecting miracles. They fought because fighting was what you did, because the alternative was corruption or death, and at least combat offered the chance to take some of the bastards with you. But this was different. The golden-armored figure in their midst fought with a precision that seemed impossible given the chaos around her, every movement economical yet devastating, her blade opening throats and severing limbs with the kind of grace that suggested art rather than butchery. She didn't fight like an Astartes, all brutal efficiency and calculated overkill. She didn't fight like a guardsman, desperate and overwhelmed. She fought like war was a dance she'd been born knowing, like violence was a language she'd spoken fluently for millennia. A bloodthirster descended from the boiling sky, its wings spanning 30 meters, its axe the size of a lemon-rust battle tank. It had ended the lives of 3 chapter masters, devoured the souls of an entire Sororitas commandery, and it fixed its burning eyes on Diana with the singular focus of a predator recognizing prey that might actually offer a challenge. "Skull for the skull throne," it bellowed, the words carrying psychic weight that burst eardrums and liquefied the brains of lesser mortals. Diana's response was to crouch, muscles coiling, and then leap, a jump that carried her 50 meters straight up to meet the demon in midair. Her blade met its axe with an impact that shattered windows in ruins 3 kilometers away, the shockwave flattening a chaos cultist charge that had been forming on the eastern flank. They fell together, locked in combat, trading blows faster than unaugmented eyes could follow. The bloodthirster's whip lashed out, barbed chain seeking to entangle, but Diana's bracers, the Misran silver sanctified in Martian forges, caught the strike and deflected it into a chunk of floating debris. Her blade found the demon's knee, shearing through brass and demonic sinew, and the greater demon roared, ichor spraying across the battlefield in arcs that burned like acid. It swung wild, desperate now, and she ducked inside its guard, driving her blade up through its jaw and into whatever passed for its brain. The lasso followed, wrapping around its neck, and Diana pulled tight. "You are nothing," she hissed in a language older than human speech, older than the warp itself. "You are the tantrum of spoiled children given form. You have no power I do not allow you." The bloodthirster clawed at the lasso, at its own throat, at reality itself. But the truth was unavoidable. It existed only because sentient beings feared and worshipped violence. Remove that belief, confront the emptiness beneath the pageantry, and it was just vapor. It discorporated with a howl that echoed across 3 dimensions, sucked back into the warp not in defeat but in dissolution, its essence too damaged to maintain cohesion. Diana landed in a crouch, breathing hard, blood and demon ichor coating her armor. Around her the battlefield had gone silent. Guardsmen stared. Chaos cultists faltered. Even the other demons seemed uncertain, their programming struggling to categorize what had just occurred. Then the cheering started. Raw, hoarse, desperate cheering from throats that had forgotten how to express joy. "Cadia stands," someone screamed, and it was taken up by 100 voices, then 1,000, the old Warcry given new life by new hope. Diana straightened, looking at the battered, bloody defenders arrayed around her, these humans who had fought for a dead world because the alternative was to admit defeat. She saw in their eyes the same thing she'd seen in Themyscira's warriors after they'd repelled Persian invasions. The disbelief that comes from surviving what should have been certain death. The fragile, desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, the universe wasn't entirely cruel. A figure approached through the smoke and rubble, a Cadian officer, her uniform torn, her face bearing scars from shrapnel and worse, her left arm replaced with a crude augmetic that still sparked from a recent hit. She saluted with her remaining hand, the gesture crisp despite obvious exhaustion. Colonel Tyra Mort, 217th Cadian Shock Regiment, or what's left of it. Her voice was steady, professional, giving nothing away. I don't know what you are, stranger. Saint Zeno's, demon wearing a pleasant mask, I've seen all three today. But you killed that bastard, and that gives you the benefit of doubt until you prove otherwise. If you're here to help, we can use it. If you're here to judge, well, we're past caring about that. Diana extended her hand. Diana, just Diana, and I'm here because no one should have to fight alone. The colonel stared at the offered hand for a long moment. Trust was currency you didn't spend lightly in the 41st millennium, then clasped it, warrior to warrior. Just Diana, Morton repeated, something like amusement flickering in her exhausted eyes. Well, just Diana. We've got 3 more breaches, ammunition for maybe another 6 hours of sustained combat, and Scuttlebutt says there's a Black Legion warband massing for an assault at dawn. Think you can earn your keep? Diana's smile was sharp as broken glass. Show me where you need me, Colonel. Let's remind these demons why humanity survived when the gods died. Around them, the defenders of Cadia's grave began to stir with renewed purpose, checking weapons, reinforcing positions, preparing for the next wave. They had been holding the line through inertia and spite. Now they had something more dangerous, a reason to believe the line might actually hold. Above them, the warp storm continued its eternal roil, but the lightning that had heralded Diana's arrival still flickered in the clouds, a reminder that even in the darkest night, sometimes the dawn found a way. Somewhere in the distance, a Voxcaster crackled to life with a transmission that would reach Imperial Command 3 weeks later. This is Cadia Fragment 77 Alpha. Reporting. Improbable survival. Request immediate reinforcement and the voice paused, uncertainty leaking through military protocol. Confirmation on new asset. Designate Golden Angel. She's Emperor's teeth. You're not going to believe this. She's winning. When the Sisters of Battle beheld her, they saw not a heathen goddess, but a saint wrought in flesh and fury, the kind of incarnate miracle their holy texts had promised would come in the Imperium's darkest hour. These were women who had dedicated their entire existence to the Emperor's worship, who had memorized 10,000 hymns and could recite scripture during firefights, who measured their faith not in words but in martyrs willingly offered to the flames. They did not give their trust lightly. They did not kneel to outsiders. But when Diana stepped into the Basilica of Holy Martyrs on the cardinal world of Ophelia VII, when her boots struck the sanctified floor, and the candles in the nave suddenly burned twice as bright without any physical cause, when the ancient reliquaries along the walls hummed in harmonic resonance with her presence, something shifted in their eyes. Each movement was liturgy, each blow, scripture written in the grammar of violence and grace. The sisters had been drilling in the basilica's training grounds when Diana arrived, and they did not stop simply because a stranger had entered their sacred space. If anything, they intensified their exercises, making a statement. This was their domain, and they would not be impressed by reputation or golden armor. Diana watched for a moment, studying their forms, seeing in their strikes the influence of Astartes' close combat doctrine filtered through 1,000 years of theological interpretation. They were good, very good, but they fought like they were always expecting to die, every technique calibrated for maximum damage in minimum time before inevitable martyrdom. There was no defense in their style, no thought for the next battle, only glorious sacrifice. You fight like you want to die, Diana said, her voice carrying across the training ground with surprising clarity. 24 sisters froze mid-strike, their power armor whirring as they turned to face the interloper who dared critique the Emperor's daughters. The canoness, a woman named Celestine, no relation to the saint, though she wore that name like a challenge to live up to, stepped forward, her plasma pistol hanging loose at her side but clearly ready to draw. We fight to serve. Death or glory are the same in the Emperor's eyes. Her tone was flat, factual, utterly certain. This was doctrine, this was truth. Then you're wasting his gifts, Diana replied, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Several hands moved to weapons. The canoness's jaw tightened, but Diana continued, stepping into the training circle, her hands empty and open. Your emperor spent centuries building the Imperium. He fought for humanity's future, not its extinction. Every sister who throws her life away on a glorious charge is one less defender standing between humanity and the darkness. Your deaths matter. Which means your lives matter. Fight like it. The words were heresy by certain readings of imperial doctrine. They were also, every sister in the room realized with uncomfortable clarity, completely true. Through her, the emperors will found new voice, echoing across the stars in waves of golden wrath that made astropaths weep tears of joy they couldn't explain. Diana began to spar with them, first one sister, then two, then 5 at once, her movements flowing like water while theirs remained rigid, bound by doctrine. She never struck to injure, but every deflection, every redirect exposed gaps in their technique, not failures of skill, but failures of philosophy. They fought to die gloriously. She fought to win, to survive, to protect. And slowly, grudgingly, they began to see the difference. A sister named Jocelyn, veteran of 17 campaigns, found herself disarmed by a technique that turned her own power armor's momentum against her. She hit the ground, staring up at Diana's offered hand, and something clicked behind her eyes. "Again," Jocelyn said, accepting the help up. "Show me again." Diana did, slower this time, breaking down the movement into components they could analyze. Soon others joined, the sparring session transforming into an impromptu workshop, decades of tactical doctrine being quietly revised in real time. The canoness watched from the sidelines, her expression unreadable, until finally she stepped forward. "Enough!" The sisters snapped to attention instantly. Celestine approached Diana, and for a long moment the two women simply stared at each other, one representing the Imperium's brutal faith, the other embodying something older, something the Imperium had tried to purge from human memory. "You're dangerous," the canoness said quietly. "Not because you're skilled, though you are. Not because you're powerful, though the warp trembles when you pass. You're dangerous because you make us question. You make us wonder if perhaps the glory of martyrdom is less important than the duty of survival. That's difficult." She didn't sound angry. She sounded tired. The exhaustion of a woman who had sent hundreds of sisters to their deaths and told herself it was holy. "I should probably execute you for ideological corruption. The Ordo Hereticus would certainly recommend it." "You could try," Diana said without arrogance, simply stating fact. "Or you could consider that maybe the Emperor's will is more complex than you've been taught. Maybe he wants you to live as much as he wants you to fight. Maybe both are sacred." She met the canoness's gaze steadily. "I'm not here to destroy your faith. I'm here to remind you what it's supposed to protect." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of candles and the distant hum of the basilica's reactors. Then, slowly, Celestine knelt, not in surrender, not in submission, but in recognition of something she'd been taught to believe was impossible, a living saint who didn't demand martyrdom, only service. The other sisters followed suit, a cascade of ceramite on stone, until Diana stood alone in a sea of kneeling warriors. She felt profoundly uncomfortable. Worship had always sat uneasily on her shoulders, but she understood the necessity. These women needed to believe in something beyond endless sacrifice. They needed to see that faith could be a shield as well as a sword. "Rise," she said softly. "The Emperor doesn't need you on your knees. He needs you on your feet, fighting for the humans who can't fight for themselves. That's the mission. Everything else is just details." They rose as one, and the canoness removed her helmet for the first time in Diana's presence. Her face was young, rejuvenate, kept most sisters looking decades younger than their real age, but her eyes were ancient, carved from experiences that would have broken lesser souls. "We will learn from you, Diana of the Messira. We will train with you, and we will fight beside you." Because apparently the Emperor has a sense of humor and decided we needed a Xenos demigod to teach us how to be human. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. The Inquisition is going to have an aneurysm when they hear about this. Even Gilliman, the avenging son, bowed his head in reverent awe when the reports reached him. Reports of entire orders of sisters abandoning suicidal assault doctrines in favor of strategic sustainability, of casualty rates dropping by 40% while victory margins increased, of faith burning brighter because it was coupled with hope rather than desperation. He stood in his private chambers on the Macrag's honor, reading the data slates with something approaching wonder. "My father works in mysterious ways," he murmured to himself, "but sending an Amazon to teach his daughters how to fight, that's either brilliant or insane." He paused. "Probably both. It usually is with him." On 1,000 worlds, statues of Diana began to appear in sororitas' chapels, unauthorized, unsanctioned but undeniable. They depicted her not enthroned or triumphant, but standing ready, shield raised, blade drawn, forever vigilant. The inscriptions varied, but the most common read, "Sancta Vigilia, the saint who would not fall." Pilgrims left offerings, broken blades from battles survived, prayer beads from campaigns won, sometimes just scraps of paper with single words written in a dozen languages. Hope, strength, tomorrow. The ecclesiarchy didn't know what to make of it, so they did what all bureaucracies do when faced with uncomfortable truths. They formed a committee to study the matter and quietly shelved the results. But in the trenches, in the void battles, on worlds where imperial faith was all that stood between humanity and the void, the Sisters of Battle fought differently now. They still sang their hymns. They still offered prayers before battle, but they also took cover when needed. They retreated tactically rather than dying pointlessly. They survived, and in surviving, they saved others. And when they were asked what had changed, they would touch the small golden icons they'd taken to wearing beneath their armor, crude representations of Diana's symbol, the double W that meant different things in different cultures, but always came back to the same concept: warrior. The Imperium was a machine built on martyrdom, fueled by faith and blood in equal measure. But maybe, just maybe, Diana was teaching it a new way to run. Not without sacrifice, that would always be necessary in this dark galaxy, but with sacrifice measured, purposeful, meaningful rather than simply glorious. It was a subtle revolution, the kind that happened in hearts and minds rather than battlefields. The kind that terrified the Inquisition because you couldn't fight it with bolters and flamers. You could only watch as it spread, person to person, prayer by prayer, until the entire edifice of imperial doctrine shifted a few degrees towards something that looked suspiciously like wisdom. And Diana, standing on the basilica's highest balcony watching the sun set over Ophelia VII's spires, allowed herself a small smile. She had fought gods and monsters. She had stood against entropy itself. But teaching these warriors to value their own lives, that might be her greatest victory yet. Yet the warp watched with envious hunger, its myriad consciousnesses fixating on the newcomer who walked through reality like she owned it, who burned with light that came from neither the Emperor nor chaos but from something other, something forgotten. In the spaces between spaces, where time was a suggestion and causality a joke, the dark gods turned their attention toward Diana with the focus of predators spotting prey that didn't understand it was prey. She was powerful. She was pure. She was perfect for corruption. Khorne saw a warrior without peer and hungered to add her skull to his throne. Slaanesh perceived beauty and nobility ripe for perversion. Nurgle recognized her vitality and wished to demonstrate the inevitability of decay. Tzeentch saw possibility, 10,000 futures where she broke in 10,000 different ways and wanted to explore them all. From its depths rose whispers, old gods recognizing one of their own who had forsaken them, divine presences that had known Diana when she was still new to the concept of mortality, when Themyscira was young, and the Amazons still remembered their original purpose. Ares spoke first, his voice like breaking bone and battlefield smoke, seeping through cracks in reality to find her consciousness during a moment of meditation. Daughter of Hippolyta, did you truly think you could escape war by fleeing to another universe? War is eternal, war is inevitable, and here in this beautiful, broken galaxy, war is God. The words carried visions, battlefields beyond counting, conflicts spanning millennia, violence elevated to religious sacrament. The Imperium was everything Ares had ever wanted humanity to become, and he wanted Diana to see it, to understand that she'd walked into his perfect creation. Reality cracked, and Olympus bled into the immaterium, its marble halls now burning in purple fire, columns that had stood for eons crumbling under the weight of chaos's attention. Diana felt it happening, felt the gods of her homeland being dragged into the warp's embrace, felt Olympus, that pocket dimension built on belief and divine will, colliding with the realm of chaos like matter meeting antimatter. The impacts sent shockwaves through both realities. On 1,000 imperial worlds, psychers screamed and bled from their eyes as the warp convulsed. On ancient Terra, the custodians surrounding the Golden Throne tightened their grips on their weapons as instruments registered impossible readings. Another pantheon, another divine realm, another set of gods being absorbed into the endless hunger of she who thirsts and her siblings. Diana faced the divine war of her birthright, upon a battlefield where belief itself was the blade, where reality was negotiable and will determine outcome more surely than any physical law. She stood in a place that was simultaneously the eternity gate on Terra, the ruins of Themyscira's temple, and the boundary between the materium and the warp. All locations collapsed into a single, impossible nexus. Before her, the gods manifested. Ares in his war aspect, 10 meters tall and armored in the screams of the fallen. Hades with eyes like dying stars, bringing the finality of endings. Even Athena, corrupted by Tzeentch's influence, her wisdom curdled into manipulation. Her strategic genius turned toward games within games within games. You cannot fight us here, Ares laughed, and his laughter was artillery thunder. This is the realm of gods, Diana. You may be our child, but you are still half-mortal, still bound by flesh and consequence. We are eternal. We are inevitable. Join us. Embrace what you are. Let Olympus merge fully with the warp, and together we will rule over this galaxy's endless conflicts. Think of it, war without end forever. It's what we were made for. His voice carried genuine enthusiasm, the joy of a being finally finding a universe that matched his nature perfectly. Diana's response was to draw her blade, the godkiller, the weapon forged specifically to end divinity when divinity became tyranny. I've killed you before, Ares. I can kill you again, as many times as it takes. Her voice was steady, but inside she felt the seduction of his offer. How easy it would be to stop fighting against the Imperium's nature, to embrace the endless war, to become the avatar of conflict she'd been born to be. How simple. But she'd spent centuries learning that easy and right were rarely the same thing. You're wrong about one thing, though. I'm not fighting you. I'm fighting what you represent, the idea that violence is all we're capable of, that war is our only destiny. You want to be eternal? Fine. I'll spend eternity proving you wrong. The battle began, and it was nothing like physical combat. They clashed with concepts, Ares throwing the inevitability of conflict against Diana's shield of compassion, the impact creating shockwaves that manifested in real space as spontaneous ceasefires on 3 warfronts. Hades wove death around her like chains, but she countered with life, with stubborn survival, with the refusal to accept endings as final. Each exchange redefined local reality, creating pockets where imperial doctrines temporarily stopped making sense, where soldiers forgot why they were fighting, where peace seemed possible for brief, shining moments before the warp's natural cruelty reasserted itself. Athena was the most dangerous because she'd always understood Diana better than Diana understood herself. "You're so proud," the corrupted goddess whispered, her voice coming from every direction simultaneously. "So certain of your righteousness. But look at what you've done. You've sworn yourself to the Imperium, Diana. The Imperium, an empire built on xenophobia, superstition, and cruelty. You've made yourself complicit in atrocities beyond counting. How long before you become what you hate? How long before you're executing civilians for worshiping the wrong god, burning worlds for ideological purity, sacrificing billions for the emperor's vision?" Each word was a needle, finding the doubts Diana tried to ignore, the compromises she'd already made, the blood already on her hands. "I know what I've done," Diana replied, and her voice cracked like thunder, raw with emotion. "I know what I've become complicit in, but the alternative is standing aside while trillions suffer because I'm too pure to dirty my hands. I'd rather be tainted and useful than pristine and useless. Yes, the Imperium is monstrous, but it's also the only thing standing between humanity and extinction, so I'll work within it. I'll change it where I can. I'll mitigate its cruelty. And if that makes me a monster too, then I'll be the monster humanity needs." The declaration rang through the warp like a bell, and for just a moment the chaos gods themselves paused to listen. Then Diana did something unprecedented. She reached out with her lasso, not to bind the gods, but to bind herself to truth. She wrapped the golden cord around her own throat, forcing herself to confront every compromise, every moral failure, every time she'd looked away from atrocity, because stopping it would mean losing strategic advantage. The pain was exquisite, not physical, but spiritual, the agony of a being who had defined herself by righteousness being forced to acknowledge how far she'd fallen. But she didn't look away, she didn't make excuses, she simply accepted it. "I am not perfect," she said, the words torn from her soul. "I will never be what I was, but I can still be what they need. That's enough. It has to be." The lasso of truth, confronted with such absolute honesty, blazed like a newborn star. Its light washed across the battlefield, and wherever it touched, illusions burned away. Ares's magnificent armor revealed itself as rusted scrap held together by hatred. Hades's inevitability showed its cracks, the places where life had persisted against all odds. Athena's wisdom unraveled into paranoid scheming, plans within plans that had lost sight of their purpose. The gods, stripped of their mystique, were just beings, powerful, ancient, but ultimately limited, locked into their domains, incapable of growth or change. They were not eternal truths, they were eternal habits. "I win," Diana said quietly, "because I can change, you can't. You're stuck being what you've always been while I can become what I need to be. That's the difference between divinity and mortality in the end. We grow." She released the lasso, and its light expanded outward in a wave that shattered the battlefield nexus like glass. Olympus tore free from the warp's grip, receding back into its own dimensional pocket, damaged but intact. The gods were cast back to their prisons and domains, their attempts at dominion frustrated by the simple truth that Diana was no longer the warrior they'd crafted, no longer bound by the limitations they'd imposed. She stood alone now in real space on the Eternity Gate's parapet, blood running from her nose and ears, the physical cost of metaphysical conflict. Custodians surrounded her, guardian spears raised, uncertain whether she was victor or threat. Diana looked at them, at these golden defenders of a broken dream, and managed a tired smile. "Tell your emperor," she said hoarsely, "that Olympus is not his enemy, not anymore. We had our own disagreements, but they're settled." She swayed, and two custodians caught her before she fell, their expressions invisible behind their helmets, but their body language speaking of something like respect. Behind her in the warp, the chaos gods watched with renewed interest. She had fought divine war and won. She had confronted her own darkness and not flinched. She was, they agreed with something approaching admiration, going to be magnificent to break. But they were patient, they were eternal, and in the 41st millennium everyone broke eventually. It was only a question of when. Still, they could wait. They could watch. And when the moment came, when Diana finally reached her limit, oh, what a prize she would make! What a champion! What a demon! But that was future talk. For now, Diana of the Themyscira had won her divine war, and the galaxy shuddered with the implications. When the final silence fell, the stars burned brighter, a new constellation etched in her likeness, visible from 1,000 worlds, a pattern that hadn't existed before but now seemed inevitable, as if the galaxy itself had reordered its stars to mark her passing. Astrocartographers went mad trying to explain how stellar positions had changed overnight, how light years of void had been rearranged by forces beyond comprehension. The Mechanicus declared it an observational error and adjusted their records accordingly. The Ecclesiarchy declared it a miracle and added it to the litany of the emperor's works. But those with eyes to see understood. Reality had been altered by will alone, and that will had worn Diana's face. The Imperium named her Sancta Invicta, the eternal shield of humanity, the title bestowed in a ceremony that made her oath-taking look modest by comparison. Representatives from every major institution attended, chapter masters of the Adeptus Astartes, Lord Inquisitors whose very names were classified, fabricator generals of the Mechanicus, abbesses of the Adeptus Sororitas, even the silent sisterhood sent observers despite their usual isolation. It was held in the Hall of 1,000 Martyrs, where the walls were inscribed with the names of everyone who'd ever sacrificed themselves for the Imperium. Billions upon billions of names in scripts that ranged from High Gothic to dead languages no one could read anymore. Diana stood in the center of it all, feeling the weight of those sacrifices pressing down like a physical thing. Gilliman performed the ceremony himself, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. In recognition of service beyond measure, in acknowledgement of sacrifices made and battles won, in witness to faith demonstrated not in words but in blood and fire, I name you Sancta Invicta. May your shield forever guard humanity's flame. May your sword forever strike at the darkness. May your will remain unbroken until the last star dies. He placed upon her shoulders a mantle woven from threads of blessed adamantium and prayers spoken by 10,000 faithful, so heavy it would have crushed a normal human but which Diana bore as if it weighed nothing. It was a burden. It was an honor. It was, like everything in the Imperium, both gift and curse. Statues rose upon every world she saved, their eyes forever fixed on the storming heavens, carved from whatever local materials could be sanctified and made permanent. On death worlds, they were carved from the bones of planet-killing monsters she'd slain. On hive worlds, they were built from reclaimed metal, 10,000 tons of scrapped machinery melted down and reformed into her image. On shrine worlds, they were wrought from marble and gold, placed in positions of honor alongside saints whose legends spanned millennia. Each statue was slightly different, reflecting local artistry and cultural interpretation, but all shared the same expression: determination without arrogance, strength without cruelty, the face of someone who would stand between you and annihilation not because she had to, but because she chose to. Children grew up praying to her image, asking Sancta Invicta to protect them from the monsters in the dark, and on worlds she'd walked, sometimes those prayers were answered. Not through divine intervention, but through the simple fact that she'd trained local defense forces, had left behind tactical doctrines, had inspired a generation to fight smarter rather than just harder. She became a symbol that transcended her physical presence. The idea that mercy and strength weren't mutually exclusive, that you could be both warrior and protector, that survival wasn't the same as victory, but it was the prerequisite for everything else. And though her voice was lost to time, the records degraded, the Vox recordings corrupted, the living memory fading as centuries bled into millennia, her oath still echoes across the Imperium, passed down through oral tradition, inscribed on weapons and armor, whispered by soldiers before impossible battles, to fight for man until the stars themselves die. It became a phrase that transcended its origin, that meant different things to different people, but always came back to the same core concept: endurance not as passive survival, but as active defiance, the refusal to surrender even when surrender was logical, the stubborn insistence that humanity deserved a future even when the present seemed to argue otherwise. In the 43rd millennium, when chaos warbands would assault a world defended by a statue of Sancta Invicta, they would sometimes pause, uncertain, as if the stone itself radiated something that made demons uncomfortable. In the 44th millennium, Sisters of Battle would touch her image before entering combat, not as superstition but as reminder. She had fought and not broken, so they could do the same. In the 45th millennium, when the last memories of Diana's true identity had been overwritten by layers of myth and theological interpretation, she remained a figure in the Imperium's pantheon, neither quite a saint nor quite a legend, but something in between that served purposes both had forgotten how to fill. Guilliman, in the rare moments when he allowed himself to be human rather than Primarch, would sometimes stand before her statue in the Macrega's Honors Chapel and wonder what she'd make of her legacy. Would she be proud that the Imperium had found room for compassion in its doctrine, however small? Or would she be horrified that even her ideals had been weaponized, turned into just another tool for the endless war machine? He suspected she'd be both. That was the tragedy of heroes in this galaxy. They could change everything and nothing, save worlds but not the system that endangered them, win battles but never the war. But perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that had always been enough. Because 10,000 years after Diana of the Messira had walked into hell wearing hope like armor, humanity still fought, still endured, still looked up at the stars and dared to believe tomorrow might be better than today. The Imperium was still monstrous, still cruel, still a million light years removed from anything resembling justice. But in the shadows of Diana's statues, in the prayers whispered in her name, in the small acts of mercy performed by soldiers who'd been taught that survival mattered more than martyrdom, there was light, fragile, flickering, easily extinguished, but present. And in the dark galaxy of the 41st millennium and beyond, presence was victory. Existence was rebellion. Every breath taken in defiance of entropy, every act of kindness performed in the face of cosmic indifference, every choice to protect rather than exploit, these were the true battles, the ones that mattered more than any void war or planet-wide invasion. Diana had understood that, had taught that. And though her body was long since dust, though her voice was silence, though her true history was buried under millennia of embellishment and theological revision, her lesson remained. On a world whose name had been forgotten, in a bunker surrounded by enemies that would not stop until every human was dead or worse, a young guardsman looked at the scratched image of Sancta Invicta someone had carved into the bunker wall. He was out of ammunition. His squad was dead. Reinforcements wouldn't arrive in time. By every logical measure, he should put his lasgun under his chin and end it quickly. But he looked at that crude carving, at those stone eyes fixed eternally on the storm, and he found himself thinking, she wouldn't quit, so neither will I. He picked up a combat knife, checked his flak armor one last time, and stepped out to meet the enemy. He would die, that was certain, but he would die standing, fighting, defiant to the last breath. And somewhere in whatever place heroes went after the fighting was done, Diana smiled. Because that's what she'd been trying to teach them all along. That the manner of your death was less important than the way you chose to live. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act anyway. That humanity's greatest weapon had never been their technology or their numbers or even their faith. It was their refusal to stop, to ever stop, to look at extinction itself and say with the full certainty of absolute conviction, not today, not ever, we will endure. And across the galaxy, in a million different languages, in a million different circumstances, humanity echoed that defiance. They were not winning. They were not safe. They might never be either, but they were still here, still fighting, still hopping against hope that maybe, just maybe, the dawn Diana had promised would someday arrive. Until then, they would be their own light, their own shields, their own strength, just as she had taught them. The stars burned on, and in their light, the Imperium marched forward into an uncertain future, armored not in ignorance, but in understanding that the fight itself was sacred, that survival was holy, that every moment humanity persisted was a victory snatched from the jaws of darkness. Sancto Invicto, the eternal shield, forever watching the storm, forever standing the watch, forever refusing to break. And the galaxy, for all its cruelty, had no choice but to respect that.